Good afternoon. I know I'm the last speaker. In baseball, we'd call this batting cleanup, so I realize that I'm standing between you and leaving. So hopefully, I provide a little bit of value, but I also think that the experience I'm going to share with you today kind of is a good capstone for all the different themes that I've heard throughout the day. So I'm Tiffany Ferris. I'm the CEO of Palantir.net, not that Palantir. And I'm a long-term director of the Drupal Association Board of Directors. So I have had a front row seat for quite a while to both the successes and the struggles of the US public sector open source adoption. So obviously, there have been some amazing successes, right? Drupal is one of the most trusted platforms for government digital infrastructure. And all of us, the community, we built this, and we're from the US, we're from Europe, we're from everywhere in the world, and we've created something truly remarkable. But what I've learned, and that I think is really important about stewardship from Drupal, is that the difference between those open source successes and what I call open source stagnation is not at all about the technology, about how good it is or how you use it. It's really about the mindset, whether you treat open source as a noun, something that you just get and something that you get to use, or if you treat it as a verb, right? Is it a practice, a culture, a way of being? So I'm here today, and I appreciate you having me. Thank you, Rosa. Because I think Europe has this really exciting opportunity. You clearly know and have implemented Drupal in some amazing ways, and we've seen those today. But you also have the policy infrastructure, you have regulatory frameworks, and you have the community expertise to turn open source over the next decade into a genuine strategic advantage as you contemplate what's next for digital sovereignty. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to share what I've seen work and where I've seen adoption kind of come up short. So if you're familiar at all with Agile, there's this phrase around distinction they like to make between doing Agile and being Agile, right? So doing Agile means like you use sticky notes and sprints and stand-ups, that kind of thing. But ultimately, you retain like a waterfall mindset, right? You're kind of the trappings of Agile are there, but you're not actually thinking about Agile. You're not actually being Agile, right? You haven't had a chance as a team yet to internalize the values, responsiveness, transparency, collaboration. And when that happens, if you're just using Agile, like trappings, right, you don't get the kind of big transformative impacts. You maybe get some 10% gains. And I think that open source is a lot like that, right? If you're just using open source, you're going to save a little bit up front on your costs because there's no licensing fees. But over time, those costs are going to start to compound, right? So I think one of the things that we've seen in the US is that there are so many examples of being open source. So I've heard so many in this room already today. But, it's about, I think, like if you think about the state of New York, right? So the state of New York adopted, Drupal installations for themselves. They have hundreds of sites. And one of the things that's really cool about their implementation is that they've created this genuine culture of contributing back. So they have on their wall posters that track how much contribution they have, right? That's a mindset of open source. They celebrate it. They're measuring it. Even like the Obama administration, which is responsible for allowing open source in government. And I know 10 years on, that seems kind of crazy that was something that, it wasn't even possible. But it took them 7 years of work to get to the place where the US wanted to default to open, right? It took all that time. And then the administration changed. Right? So one of the key things that we see in public sector success is it often starts with a champion, right? Somebody in an organization who understands what it means to participate fully in an open source community, someone who fought for contribution time for the in-house team or fought to put contribution rights in contracts, right? Who held the line against over-customization. And those champions are super important as a catalyst for the change necessary to adopt open source. But that can't be where the program stops, right? In long term, you're going to need more than that. So you're going to need this open source mindset, which is a commitment to transparent collaboration, sustainable contribution, and design for reuse. So you need to mature beyond those initial champions and become very operationalized into your policies. That's kind of where we've stalled out, right? This is where the stagnation has occurred in the US, and I call it the procurement problem. I think I'm the fifth person today to talk about procurement. I think that's where we've seen things go off track. So we've had 10 years of default to open, and as part of the policy, the executive order that went into place, the US is requiring that 20% of any government-written code be open sourced. So that seemed like a huge win, but because it was led by champions who ended up leaving, right, the rollout to actually adopt that policy was incomplete, and it's under-resourced. Sound familiar? So I think that while we've increased our use of open source in the US, it's come from a compliance mindset, like a checkbox. Do you have open source? Great, okay, you're fine now. So I think that procurement is where we want to look as that lever, because they're the drivers of systemic change. They're the ones who reflect what the actual policy landscape is within, within your adoption of open source. So U.S. procurement, I would say, is very Drupal aware, but they look at it as a free resource, a shortcut to this policy compliance. And I'm sure it's going to be a familiar story maybe to those in the room, but here's what happened, right? So we see that contracts go to firms that treat Drupal as a zero cost input, right? They don't. So then they take it and they make an implementation that is so customized that it's essentially a completely proprietary product built with Drupal. And then they charge millions of dollars to maintain it. So in those cases, that whole virtuous cycle, that flywheel effect, the regenerative impact of open source, they're gone. They're completely gone. Bugs get fixed, but just for one client. New features are developed, but never shared. The federal government has paid over and over and over again for the same Drupal feature or Drupal bug. And when the community fixed bugs, sometimes these installations couldn't even take it on board because they were so customized. So, I think it is fair to say maybe the U.S. just hired the wrong people, right? You hired the wrong vendors. But I think it's actually a systemic problem, right? And so if we look at it from that perspective, the procurement system doesn't accidentally favor extractors. It's designed to favor them, right? Procurement focuses on hourly rates. So a firm that's offering cheap, junior folks who know PHP is going to win over a firm like, a Palantir or the firms that have, spoken here today that actually incorporate the fact that they contribute back into their hourly rates. So lowest price technically acceptable rules favor these extractive takers to everyone's detriment. The government who bought cheaper hours and got a worse product and paid more in total, and then the community and the project that loses out. So there's also another phenomenon I want to talk about, and Mike kind of alluded to it earlier, which is, Dries talks a lot about the makers and the takers. I want to talk about the fakers, right? So this is a particularly annoying set of the takers for me, because in the US, after we had the default to open policy go into place, it seemed like a really good idea that people said that we do open source as part of their marketing, right? And firms could claim that they had community leadership because they'd sponsored a coffee at an event somewhere, right? That's not the same thing at all. But procurement officers couldn't tell the difference between someone who sponsored a core maintainer and someone who was a silver sponsor, right? All they see is, oh, I've got two vendors claiming expertise. I'm going to pick the cheaper one, and then we as the ecosystem suffer. So this kind of extractive open source adoption is what's led to the kind of stagnation, I think, in the US public sector of the adoption. So we haven't seen the kind of massive, excellent contribution and implementations that we've seen in Europe, right? And I think that's something to be really proud of, right? I think, though, it's important for us to start talking about that harm and what could go differently, right? So in Europe, I think that, as I mentioned, you have this incredible opportunity now. And the alternate strategy, if we're actually thinking about raising open source at an even broader level across Europe, is to think about it as an ecosystem, right? And take an ecosystem-based strategy. So here's the metaphor I like to use. In the US, sometimes procurement officers think about open source as like a free resource, like it's like wood, right? You can just acquire the lumber and use it how you will, and you're done with it. But instead, think about it as a river, right? So Drupal or Linux or Python, right? These are global rivers. And they're going to run through the US, they're going to run through China, they're going to run through the global south, they're going to run through Europe, and no one can dam them. No one should want to, right? You don't want to take that, you don't want to make it your own. The global participation is what actually gives it its power and gives it its depth. And here's what I think, that digital sovereignty isn't about owning the river, it isn't about owning that water. Ultimately, it's about making sure that the water is clean and usable. That's all we really care about. So if the default approach to open source is, right now, it's to let that water flow downstream, and then when it gets to you, you filter it, right? And we spend a lot of time filtering it. But that means that every agency, every department, every ministry, you're building your own filters for what makes something compliant for you, or what makes something secure for you. So we spend millions of dollars, millions of euros on these compliance checks and security audits after the code has arrived, after the water's gotten to you. So an ecosystem strategy flips this on its head. Instead of filtering at the tap, you invest upstream. You collaborate with others to create those water treatment plants, if you will, at the source of the water. And in real terms, what that means is that you fund the project infrastructure, you support the foundation, you fund security teams, you pay maintainers to keep the river clean before it even gets to you. So that might seem like an impossibly large task, but given that 96% of the value of open source comes from 5%, it actually doesn't take a lot to influence and to have significant impact on these kind of open source projects. And so here's the kind of the strategic insight that I've come to, is that when we invest upstream, you don't just get clean water for yourselves, you ensure that the water flowing to the rest of the world, the open source code flowing to the rest of the world, meets European standards. And your standards, I think, are the highest in the world, right? You're leading in technology policy. Another one of the key things that I've learned is that open source governance isn't about control, right? Influence is the best you got. And you don't control it by forking it. You can try and siphon off a little bit of that river, but you're just going to get a stagnant pool. You don't really want that. You need the dynamic river. You need the flowing to actually reap the value of open source. And what we know is that when you contribute to open source, you're influencing the project. The people who show up, the people who do the work, the people who maintain the code, they're the ones who steer it. Right? They're the ones who decide what's happening next. And this is that inevitable evolution in open source, right? It starts out as volunteer-driven, and some of us in this room have been here since no one was employed to do Drupal. And then it goes to commercially sponsored, which is kind of what we see right now. But Dries has made this point that there's a natural evolution to public infrastructure, and it goes from paths that people walked on, to then roads that people needed for commerce, to then maintained by government stewardship. And I think that we're at that moment, or near that moment, for open source. That it's not about charity, it's about the government stepping in and saying, this is a public infrastructure, this is public utility. So, imagine a future where we start to take that on, especially in a place like Europe, where you've embraced really the transformative power of open source, right? You see that potential, and we need to actualize it. So if we had, if the EU were able to give €3 million a year, right? Which in the US is less than the cost of a single failed IT project, or less than what it might cost to maintain 5 kilometers of road, right? What would that look like, right? It basically means that you would have probably 20 Drupal core maintainers with one mandate, right? Make GDPR compliance, make accessibility standards, the CRA disclosures, the IDOS integration, all the default standards for Drupal, right? So then what happens is somebody in California goes to download Drupal. They don't care, they don't know about European law, but when they install Drupal, the defaults are privacy first, accessibility first, interoperability first. And then when they contribute, they extend it by those same principles. So because the EU is paid to architect it that way, they're importing and then reinforcing European values, not because they read your regulations, but because they used your code, and their contributions continue your standards. I think about this as the Brussels effect for open source. There's a future where the European standard becomes that global de facto standard. And I think there's a lot of value for everyone in this room and beyond should that happen. So as been mentioned a couple times today, I think one of the key pieces here that makes this the right time, not just for Europe, but the right time for Drupal, is the fact that we now have recipes. I think recipes change a lot of things. Maybe it will resonate with some of you that distributions can be hard. It is really difficult to maintain a distribution over time, especially if you were thinking about a shared feature set across nations, right? That's a really difficult thing. And ultimately, even with the best of intentions, sometimes they become forks. They become difficult and heavy and hard. But recipes kind of solve this, right? A recipe is just configuration applied to standard Drupal modules. It doesn't customize Drupal, it just configures it. So, in this conversation around what digital sovereignty looks like, I don't think that Europe needs a Euro Drupal, right? You don't need that. But I think there's two really important things. One is a curated, composable list of public sector recipes for common use cases. Break everything down into the smallest possible composable chunks, whether it's digital identity integration or GDPR, accessible portals, configuration is the way to go, not code forks or distributions. And the second thing is security audits and maintenance for the modules that those recipes depend on. So you're not maintaining a distribution, but I think that the interoperability of Drupal starts to go up tremendously if we all start to think and convert things over into recipes. I loved hearing the local gov folks talk about how they're going to move their distribution over to recipes. Hopefully that makes their burden a lot easier, and it also will mean make it easier for everyone else to pick up just the components they need from their work. So we've seen this work in the US, primarily at the state level, and usually with a top-down, mature open source program in action. So federally, we don't have any kind of coherent open source strategy that mandates reuse or interoperability or even cross-agency collaboration. I think, but unlike the US, Europe does have that, right? You do have the Interoperable Europe Act and the convening infrastructure to scale the patterns, which is why I think Europe seems to have more multi-agency platform rollouts. You're using it in a different way than I've seen in the US yet, and I think it's to your advantage. And I also just have to give a shout out to the Germany's Sovereign Tech Fund. I'm wearing my Drupal hat. The funding that they've been able to provide to open source in general, but Drupal in particular, has been very important to us, right? It helped us finish that GitLab migration. So I'm excited to think about how Drupal might be able to work even more closely to enable greater adoption, effectiveness, and efficiency with Europe, right? So imagine if like the Interoperable Europe portal were able to serve as a knowledge hub for all the kinds of things that we've talked about today, sharing that the best practices and different pieces, connecting those member states who are solving the same problems with Drupal at kind of that recipe level. Leveraging maybe the OSS catalogs or maybe making it easier to find them on Drupal.org. I think that the Sovereign Tech Fund certainly provides the upstream investment that we would need, but if there were an EU Sovereign Tech Fund, that could do even more, right? You would combine that with the portal and the knowledge sharing and coordination, and then you start to really feel that flywheel effect in Europe, right? And beyond, right? You fund the maintenance, you share the solutions, you scale the impact. So this is how adopting an ecosystem strategy might help the European members achieve those transformational results that we haven't seen yet globally, right? And we could. So the first step, I think, as everybody has talked about, is procurement policy. And so there's three kind of key pieces here. One is the sovereign score. So I think that we need to introduce, in addition to technical and pricing, something that says that 20% of the tender points are for verified contribution. Drupal makes it easy and makes it easier to tell the makers from the takers and the fakers. I also think that we need to move open source maintenance billing above the line. So right now it is a below the line cost that gets baked into all of our hourly rates. Pull it up, make it a flat fee. So say that 5% of hours needs to go toward open source maintenance. So even if you had a taker who picked it up, they would still have to do that. And then also a 30-day upstream rule, which is that 30 days after you fix a bug or you add a new feature, it needs to be released. So this is how you take public money, public code, and you make it mandatory, measurable, and strategic. So I again want to stress, I think that the EU Sovereign Tech Fund is an important and kind of key moment here. I'm optimistic, and I really hope you can put that in there. And then the second is to modernize and align your procurement. So with the sovereignty score, the upstream contribution requirements, and then the 30-day upstream first approach. So with that, I just want to leave you that I think that the tools are ready, the models are proven, and the economics are clear that the best way to digital sovereignty for any of us is to do it with all of us. And so the more of us who are focused on this, the more we can, whether it's in the US or in Europe, the more we can kind of use open source with this mindset of actual reuse, actual collaboration, actual contribution, then we can really start to experience and amplify those flywheel effects. It gets better the more of us who come here. It gets regenerative, so the more people who come, we're not depleting the resources of the commons. I think a healthy commons is the foundation of real sovereignty for any of us. It's the ability to adapt. It's the ability to evolve and control without asking permission of anybody. So, thank you.